might be time to elevate your bourbon experience, and I'm going to give you a few different tips as to how to do that. So the main key here is we all start somewhere. I think as an enthusiast myself and as somebody that reviews whiskeys and goes to these events and talks with people, I see it time and time again where so many people start one place and then they go into another direction. Maybe they get the bug pretty hard and then they start trying all these different things and they want to share all these things, and that's great. But you have to remember where you started, and you have to remember that originally when you got into bourbon, it wasn't comparing batch B524 to batch C924 and all this other stuff. It could be something as simple as just going to a bar and ordering Jim and Coke or Jack and Coke or Makers on the Rocks or Basil Hayden or whatever it is. And I think people kind of forget the fact that that's where a lot of us started. We started with Woodford Reserve or Maker's Mark and Jim Beam, some of these. So I'm trying to just take it back a little bit. And if that's where you are right now, I want to give you some other options as to where you can go from here, because I think we put so much emphasis on the beginner bourbon. And I think most of those lists are wrong, in my opinion. I think that we get so focused on an enthusiast's beginning bourbon that we kind of forget about the actual beginner's bourbon. The actual beginner bourbon might not even be a bourbon. Whiskeys like Crown Royal, Jack Daniels, which bourbon, yes, no. But there's other products that get people into bourbon and at least get them exposed. And that's kind of where I think a lot of people start, and we got to remember that. But I could type in beginner's bourbon right now, and I bet a lot would pop up on YouTube. But the thought that I had was, what after that? So now you got your beginner's bourbon. There's something that you started with, or there's something that you already realized that you enjoy. Where do you go from there? So I'm going to answer that question today for a few bottles that I think will be helpful. The other key here that I kind of thought through is just because you want to elevate that experience a little bit. I've tried Jack Daniels. I want to try something else, but I don't really know where to go. And I also don't want to spend that much money. You have that direction. And then you have other people that are saying, hey, I'm all in. I want to try something, even if that means paying a little bit more for that. So in all these categories, I've tried to create a budget option and an elevated option. And I also thought that it's best to kind of stick with that distillery because you're familiar with those flavor profiles. So if all you drink is Jack and Cokes, then sticking with Jack Daniels, to me, is a smart decision, especially nowadays where these distilleries are just creating so many different products across the board that you can actually maintain that same flavor profile foundation and then just keep building from there and just keep trying some of their more elevated products, some of which you don't need to break the bank on, some of which you can pay a little bit more and get a little bit better of experience. But like I said, we're going to cover all your bases today. Jack Daniels might be where you started, and if it was Jack and Coke or Jack, even just neat or whatever it is that you're drinking and you're trying to figure out where to go from here. But again, budget wise, I still don't want to spend that much money. I just want a little bit better of a whiskey or a little bit better of a product. The first spot I think you go is Jack Daniels Bonded. It's 100 proof, bottled in bond, has all these requirements, one of which being that whiskey has to be bottled at 100 proof. So it's literally Jack Daniels whiskey, but bonded. That also tells us that it's at least 4 years, which I believe it to be older from everything I've read. And again, 100 proof. So I think it's just a better option. So I would say with Jack Daniels specifically, if you've had Jack Daniels Old No. 7, just the regular Jack Daniels, if you've been out at a bar and all that stuff, and that's not really been for you, I would still suggest trying other Jack Daniels products, because that happened to me. I went to an event one time years ago and there was a Jack Daniels rep there, wanted me to try some of their products, and I said, nope, Jack and I are not friends. I just don't really care for that whiskey. And they asked me, have you tried anything else other than Old No. 7? And I said no. And when I started trying their other products, I realized that I just don't like Old No. 7, but a lot of their other products are fantastic. And I think that's where you start to explore. So the bonded version of this, I think, is a great place to start. Price-wise, it should not be anything crazy. It should be, I've seen it less than $30. I would say, I don't know that I've ever seen it for more than 40. So it should not be going that high, even with the prices of things coming up. But whatever you see it at, I do think it's probably worth it, unless that store has marked this up crazy, thinking that these are limited. They're not limited. So if you do see a crazy price on this, don't pay it. Just to find another place that's selling it at a better price. But I think that's a great option to go to after your Jack Daniels experience. And if you're looking for your elevated experience from this, I would do Jack Daniels single barrels. Now, again, same type of deal. This was actually the first one. So that story I told where the guy, wanted me to try their things, the first thing he poured was that bottle, the Jack Daniels single barrel. And I took one sip and I thought, what is this? This isn't That's not Jack Daniels. You must have switched something. I don't know. It's different than what I remember from the old number 7. And again, that's where I started to realize, like, no, I just don't like that particular expression, but the rest of these are very good. You'll hear a lot of people talk about barrel proof, and even the barrel proof rye now is talked about quite a bit. But again, for somebody who's just starting out, I think a barrel proof whiskey is too high for a lot of people. Not saying people can't handle it or anything like that, but to start your journey on a 80 proof, 84, 90 proof bourbon, and then try to go to 130 proof plus, I think is crazy. You're going to burn out your palate and you're not going to get any flavor out of this thing. So I think that the natural progression of things kind of helps when it comes to proof. And once you start to get acclimated and used to those proof points, then you can kind of keep moving up. And this single barrel is only 94 proof. So I think you're still going to feel the jump, but I don't think it's going to be anything crazy that's going to turn you away to a whiskey altogether. So even though barrel proofs get all the attention and all the love, I don't think there's anything wrong with these single barrels. And especially there's so many now that are like from stores. So if you go to stores, especially a store that you trust, maybe there's a liquor store where you've started to kind of get to know some of the people in the area or whatever it is, they might have their own barrel pick version of this. And I think that's bonus points for that. But this, I would say, is a little bit more elevated than the Bonded. They're both more elevated than the Jack Daniels Old Number 7 and are great options to go to if you started with Jack and want to kind of move on. All right, number 2, Maker's Mark. Now, again, this bottle is available at probably every bar that you go to. That's going to probably be the case for everyone on this list. Maker's Mark is 90 proof. It's wheated. So all of those things make it more approachable. For those that may not know, a lot of the times when somebody says a bourbon is wheated, that's just referring to the recipe. So yes, bourbon has to be made of at least 51% or more of corn, but the secondary grain within that, or some people call it the flavoring grain, is either rye or wheat majority of the time. That's not always the case. So if wheat is the secondary grain or the second largest percentage of grain in that bourbon, then a lot of times we call it a wheated bourbon. The impact of wheat on a bourbon actually a lot of the times makes it a softer, more approachable whiskey. So if you do that at a lower proof, it's even more approachable. So I think this is kind of why I think a lot of people go to Maker's Mark. It's a little bit of a sweeter profile, definitely approachable. It's in every bar, it's accessible, it's not crazy priced, anything like that. So I think this is why a lot of people start here. And this is one of the places that I started in my journey, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But again, it's amazing how the different proof points, you can kind of mess around with them, right? So I think to go from a 90 proof Maker's Mark to even the Maker's 101. Maker's Mark 101, I think is just, it's a fantastic proof point. Before 2020, let's just word it that way. Maker's Mark had Maker's Mark 101, which is just 101 proof, and it was a distillery only exclusive. When the distillery was not open to the public, they ended up distributing this all across the country and made it more available. And everything I've ever read said that that was supposed to be a limited release. Well, obviously that was 4 years ago and it's still on the shelves. I am very happy that it's still on the shelves and not a limited release. I did a video way back when where I actually said that I hope you keep this going, because even just adding the proof points going from 90 to 101, it makes the world of difference to me in terms of somebody who's drinking whiskey neat. I get a lot more character to that bourbon at 101 proof, and it just provides a little bit more depth. It just provides a little bit more oomph. Is that a way to put it in whiskey? There's just more going on in that whiskey that makes it a little bit more interesting at that proof point than it does at the 90 proof. So even back then, I just said, I wish that they would just keep this proof point. I think it's a fantastic one and really highlights a lot of their notes. And again, I've seen this bottle for $30. So this would be your budget option here. Elevated experience from your regular Maker's Mark. It's familiar. It's not going to pull you in a whole different direction. It's just going to take what you know and kind of elevate it a little bit more. In another direction you could go as well is Maker's 46. So Maker's 46, I know I just said all that about the 101 being a great proof point, and it is. Maker's 46 is 94 proof. What Maker's 46 actually does is, with this process, they take Maker's Mark bourbon, as you are familiar with, and they actually use French oak staves. Just long pieces of wood that make the barrel up. Those are staves. They have different processes for what they do with each of these staves, but the 46 has its own process. I'll save you all the rest of the details, but they have their own process for that stave. And what they do is they take 10 of those, they open up the barrel that has the Maker's Mark whiskey in it, they drop those staves in that barrel, all 10 of them, and then they continue to age it. So now you're finishing it with oak staves. That's what that's referring to. So originally they had Maker's 46, and then they rebranded it, I think 1,000 times since then, because it, I guess, was causing more confusion. And I've actually been in liquor stores plenty of times where I hear people get this wrong, where they say like the new one is French oak and the old one wasn't. That's not the case. It's the same bourbon for all of these. They just keep changing the label So if you see 46 anywhere on a maker's label, that's what this is. So whatever bottle is available to you in the store, it may be a little different. The price here is not crazy, but it is above that $30 range. So that's where I put it kind of in that elevated category. But I still don't really think that it's like their superior product or anything like that. But I love Maker's 46 even to this day. There's other products that they have, the Maker's Cask Strength. They have the Maker's 46 Cask Strength, which is one of my absolute favorites. But again, if you're just getting into whiskey, it's okay not to go to cask strength. 94 proof can still be very hot to somebody who's just trying to drink whiskey neat or trying to learn how to do that, or even drinking on the rocks. So don't feel the need to jump up to 115, 120 proof bottles. All right, Jim Beam bourbon. Again, all these bottles are going to be available everywhere. I'm just telling you that right now. All those things I just said about Makers and Jack Daniels, it all applies here with Jim Beam. Available everywhere, cheap price, good bourbon, all that stuff. The funny thing is, I actually don't have a bottle of just regular Jim Beam. All these bottles I have, and I don't know. For some reason I thought I did, but I do not. So this is just like a stand-in. So just pretend like this is Jim Beam white label. But yes, going along with the same logic, let's think of some budget options and some elevated options. For a budget option, I would actually suggest their new product, Jim Beam Winter Reserve, which is a toasted barrel finish Jim Beam. The only thing I would say here is that it's not available everywhere, so it's supposed to be a limited edition and all that stuff. So this is something that I think is very good for what it is. I'm not saying this is going to be the best whiskey you've ever had in your life or anything like that. I'm just saying that compared to the regular Jim Beam, I think that this is a really good product, and I like its place within the Jim Beam family. I think if you can't find this, I don't think there's anything wrong with, there's several. There's Jim Beam Double Oaked, there's Jim Beam Single Barrel, and even the Jim Beam Extra Age, which is a black label. Those are all good go-tos as well. I would maybe start with some of those in terms of, the budget side of things, and they're not that expensive, and I think even at those price points, you could try different ones and just see which one you prefer. But I just don't think you can go wrong with any of those, especially just coming from drinking regular Jim Beam. Now, I think in terms of an elevated experience, I would actually recommend Knob Creek 12 year. This bottle, I've seen more and more and more hit the shelves. It seems like there is a ton of this now. I've gone on record and said I am not the biggest Knob Creek fan. Most Knob Creeks I actually do not care for. There are a few different picks that I've had that I've enjoyed, and I think the problem is the very first Knob Creek I ever had was like a 14, 15-year-old barrel pick that was like 120 proof, and it was absolutely amazing, and it's one of my favorite bourbons I've ever had. So to go from that to a non-age stated 100 proof Knob Creek just didn't do it for me. I felt like it needed more age, and I felt like it needed more proof. Well, the age statements have come back, and now you can find a Knob Creek 9 year, and I know a lot of people actually recommend the Knob Creek 9 year 120 proof to a lot of beginners. But as I've mentioned, I just feel like 120 proof is a lot. And depending on how that person is trying to enjoy their bourbon, that may not be the best option for them. And I also think, there's nothing wrong with a 9 year whiskey, but I just think the difference between that 9 year and this 12 year are great. I don't think that the difference between the 12 year and the 15 or the 12 and the 18 are really enough to justify the prices there. But I do think there's enough there to justify the price jumping from the 9 year to the 12 year. And again, either way, if you're starting with Jim Beam White Label, I really don't think you're going to have a problem or feel slighted by buying this bottle. I think it's a really good option. And just to clarify, Knob Creek is a brand distilled by Jim Beam. Wild Turkey 101, a lot of us have had some good times and maybe some bad with Wild Turkey 101. But again, nothing I can say here that's any different than anything else I said. Available everywhere, very good bourbon. Can't go wrong with this bottle in general. A lot of people actually have learned to not like this bottle because they were either shooting it or trying to just force themselves to drink it at a high proof and just don't care for it one way or another. So let's think of some other options for you. All right, on the budget side of things, which is kind of funny to call this budget, but I've found it in my area for like 30, 35 bucks. So Wild Turkey 101 typically goes around 20, 22, something like that, depending on your area, of course. All these prices are depending on your area, but at least in my area, that's kind of what it's going for. Russell's 10, $30, $35 range. I think I've seen it as high as $40. Still not terrible for a 10-year bourbon by any means. So not only age stated at 10 years, it's listed there on the bottle, which those that are not as familiar, an age statement on a bottle is just the youngest whiskey in that blend. So if any whiskey puts on there that it's 10 years old or 15 years old or whatever, they're taking possibly thousands of barrels and trying to blend this in together to get one flavor profile. So they're telling you that the youngest barrel in that whole batch is at least 10 years. So they could be blending a 10 year, a 13, a 15, an 18, whatever, and they're taking all these barrels and blending it together. But they can only put 10 years on the label because that's the youngest one there. So in a lot of cases, a lot of the barrels in the blend are probably 10 years, but we don't really know. But we do know that it's all at least 10 years. So yes, a 10-year age-stated bourbon at that price point, and it's only 90 proof again, so a little bit more approachable. There's going to be a lot of oak there, so I think you start to learn whether you like that profile or not. I've heard some people even call it the Wild Turkey Funk. They just think Wild Turkey has its own type of profile. And I would agree with that to a certain extent, but I think going from Wild Turkey 101 to Russell's 10-year kind of starts to elevate your experience without really breaking the bank. All right, now for your elevated option, I would go Kentucky Spirit. Now, the proof is actually the exact same. It's 101. So if you are familiar with Wild Turkey 101 and that proof point, then the Kentucky Spirit option should not be an issue. Kentucky Spirit is also distilled by Wild Turkey, and it is their single barrel offering. But I'm sure as they're going through tasting certain barrels, maybe before they blend it for the Wild Turkey 101 process, I don't know. I'm sure they're going through these barrels and just trying them to see, yep, this is a Wild Turkey Kentucky Spirit single barrel right here. The cool thing is Wild Turkey actually puts on their labels which warehouse and all that stuff that it's coming from. So when you really start to nerd out, you can actually start to hunt some of these Kentucky Spirits and find certain warehouses that you enjoy and all that stuff. But again, for right now, let's stay away from all that and let's just try what you got for what it is. I think this is a Wild Turkey product that just flies under the radar. Everybody talks about Wild Turkey Rare Breed, 101, all that stuff. I just don't hear Kentucky Spirit mentioned as often, and I really think it should be mentioned. I think it's a great option. People talk about Blanton's all the time. Blanton's is a single barrel, and so is Kentucky Spirit. So I think because of Rare Breed, people just don't talk about Kentucky Spirit as much. But again, going to 116 proof, I still think is way too high. The 101, I think, is an excellent proof point, especially for those that are new to whiskey. All right, and Woodford Reserve. See this a lot of the times around Derby time. This is one of the sponsors of the Kentucky Derby. Same thing as everything else I've already said on this list. I can't. The thing that I will say about this that's a little different, they use a pot still in the distillation process instead of a column still. So it does change the profile a little bit more. I think Woodford as a brand itself already kind of presents itself as an elevated experience. So I think that does make it a little bit more challenging in terms of how do we elevate from here, or where do we go from here? The other piece of this that makes it a little bit challenging, they don't actually make that many products. They have a lot of like finishes and they do a one-off type of experimental type of batches. For the most part, they just make Woodford Reserve. So for this, we'll go the other way. We'll mention the elevated experience first. The elevated side of it would be their double oaked offering. So basically what they do is they take the Woodford Reserve, they age it in the barrel, and then they take it another barrel and they just dump that bourbon into the other barrel. That's a double oaked bourbon. I love Woodford double oaked. I think it's a great bottle. I've put this on lists for beginners as well. I think it just adds a lot more character to the whiskey. I think it just changes the profile enough, sweetens it up a little bit, adds chocolate notes, still is approachable, but they also still do a great job of, again, making this just feel elevated. I know for me back in the day when I would buy double oaked, I mean, you thought I would be buying Pappy Van Winkle when I was buying, Woodford double oaked, because it was like, yeah, that's Woodford. Everybody knows Woodford, but this is double oaked. And back then, when I started drinking double oaked, it was actually the same bottle as Woodford. It was before they adjusted to the small squatty bottle. It was the same bottle, but it was a different label on the front. So, especially once they changed the bottle and all that, I just really felt fancy about it and thought I was just killing the game. Thought I was doing great. But yes, a little bit higher of a price point. I think it's typically around $50 if I'm remembering correctly, but in my opinion, it's well worth it. So I decided to think outside the box when it comes to a budget option, but yet still elevating your experience. I decided to go with Cooper's Craft 100. I think if you are starting with Woodford Reserve and you kind of want to try something different, I thought, with the fact that Woodford Reserve only really has Woodford Reserve and the Woodford Double Oaked, I have seen the batch proof a little bit more shelf stable lately. It's been available. I can find it now. But again, too high of a proof. So yes, you have experimental batches and all that stuff, but they don't really have much else. So I started thinking through the fact that Woodford Reserve is actually owned by a company named Brown-Forman. Brown-Forman also owns the brand Cooper's Craft 100. There's two different Cooper's Craft options that are out there. My favorite is the 100 proof, and I still think, especially when you're just like first starting out with whiskey, but when you're kind of looking for that next step, I think 100 proof is a great proof point to kind of jump to. Anywhere between 94 and 100, that range, I think is a good range to go to. But even given that, the thing that I've said about the Cooper's Craft, when I reviewed this, I thought it was good, but I thought it was, it's one of these ones that people just like to say is good and don't really spend that much time with it. Well, the more time I spent with it, I actually experimented a little bit and added a drop of water into a neat glass. And what I realized is that drop of water made the world of difference to this bourbon. Drinking it neat, I thought it was okay. I just didn't think it stood out. Adding that one drop of water changed this enough that I changed my overall rating and review and my whole thought process on this bourbon altogether. And now I recommend this bottle all the time, but I always add in that one piece of the way I enjoyed it was just adding one drop of water, which I think goes to prove the point of just experiment with your bourbon. Find one that you like, Start with that base. And then from there, try it with an ice cube. Try it neat. Try it with a drop of water. Try it with a few drops of water. Try it in a cocktail, an old fashioned, a Manhattan, whatever you need to do. Just explore your whiskey. Just try different things. And what I've realized is there's certain bottles that I like in certain situations, and there's nothing wrong with that. Thank you all for tuning into this video. Hopefully you found this helpful. Hopefully you now know the direction to go. If you have any other suggestions as to where people can go next within their bourbon journey after they're kind of getting started with some of these bottles, write them in the comments. Let's help each other out as a community. As always, thank you all so much for all the love and support that you always continue to show me. You've watched to the end. You might as well like, subscribe, do all the things. Follow me on Patreon for exclusive content. All of my reviews are on there. All of my blog posts are on there. And you can even join for free. Thanks again for all the love, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.